Okay. Now we will take time to introduce you to our speakers. Once again, I'm Erin, and in my role at Raymond, I provide CFO services, consultation, report preparation, and department oversight to public sector clients. As a collaborative member of my clients' leadership teams, I aim to empower management and governing bodies to make informed decisions with easy to understand reports and presentations. Christy provides risk advisory services to clients across a wide range of industries in various stages of maturity. She works closely with boards, audit committees, and management to understand risk and provides tailored solutions to mitigate risk within their environment. As a leader in Raymond's Technology Solutions Group, Jessica oversees cybersecurity assessments, information technology security assessments, vulnerability and penetration testing, social engineering testing, and information security training. Michelle partners with public sector organizations to make their financial operations more efficient, compliant, and mission driven. Through CFO consulting and outsourced accounting support, she helps clients achieve financial stability, streamline processes, and improve reporting transparency, all while staying focused on what matters the most, their mission. Her goal is to serve as a trusted advisor, solving immediate financial challenges while building capacity for long-term success. In today's presentation, we are going to look at four main categories of risk and talk through some of the strategies to build resilience within your organization. We will review cybersecurity, fraud, board activity, and third-party vendor management. To start us off, Jessica, what are some current trends you're seeing in the cybersecurity environment?
Thanks, Erin. Some of the cybersecurity trends more recently we've been seeing is a continued increase in sophisticated phishing attacks. With the use of AI, these hackers out there are getting very sophisticated in making sure that they're using those tools available to them to be able to craft these emails in a way that makes it look very real. And it makes it hard to detect that it's a phishing email. Back 10 years ago, it was a little bit easier to detect spelling, grammar, those types of things in those phishing emails. But today, utilizing the technology that's available to them, they're getting very good at making these emails look like they're very real. So we've seen that continued increase in that. We're also seeing using cyber criminal services for hire. So it is out there. It's very easy to get these cyber criminals out there on the web. So we're seeing more of that activity. We're also seeing sharing of victim information. When the ransomware attacks first started years ago, they were really truly ransomware attacks, and they were shutting down the environments and holding the environments hostage. But now what they're doing, and tying this into this next one, diversifying approaches to extorting money, they're holding that sensitive information that they've got, and they're essentially trying to extort for that sensitive information. And then they're sharing that victim information out there as well too. Targeting the cloud. So a lot of organizations have moved from in-house servers to the cloud. And so that bad guys are targeting the cloud since they know that that's where, a lot of organizations' data lives these days. Also, we've seen an increase in targeting managed service providers. So the bad guys know that managed service providers have a lot of access, have a lot of information related to their customers. So they've been going after the managed services providers to essentially see if they can get in and utilize that as a pivoting point into the other organizations as well too. Targeting on holidays and weekends. They know that, a lot of organizations are closed on the holidays and the weekends, and people aren't actively working at those periods of time. So essentially, they're targeting organizations during those periods of time where they would be essentially more vulnerable and less likely to respond as quickly. So those are some of the cybersecurity trends we've been seeing more, Erin.
Wow. Um,
Some of the cost of a data breach from the Ponemon Institute. This is a institute that's actually based up in Traverse City. And just to give you some statistics around that, the average total cost of a data breach in 2024 was 4.88 million. The average cost of a malicious insider attack, so this is someone who is maliciously working inside an organization, was 4.99 million. The highest country average cost actually is in the United States. Share of breaches involving personal identifiable information was about 46%. And then time to identify and contain a breach was about 258 days. So you think about that, someone getting into your organization and sitting there for 258 days, that is a long time. It's a long time for them to essentially be able to plan their attack and essentially, figure out, what the day-to-day activities are in an organization, who's moving money in and out. So it's very important to make sure that you've got tools that are actively monitoring and looking for anomalies within your environment. And then the highest industry costs is healthcare. Healthcare records, do have a lot of sensitive information in them, and so with that, that tends to be, where those bad guys want to get that information.
Brings it into perspective on how important it is to dedicate resources to addressing these cyber threats. What are some of the most common ways you are seeing bad guys get in?
So this here is what I call the bad guys toolkit, if you will. So these are a lot of the ways that they're using to get in. So phishing, web, and ransomware, I would say in our work continues to be one of the ways that the bad guys are continuing to get in and continuing to target organizations. Like I said, they're getting very good at crafting those emails to get people to click on links and download malicious, software in it, not intentionally, but behind the scenes from that perspective. Compromised credentials. So there's a lot of breaches that happen. I'm sure everyone on here has probably been part of some breach that has occurred out throughout your time. And so those compromised credentials then usually end up on the dark web. And so the bad guys use those compromised credentials to see if they can get into any other accounts you have, because what we know is that people use the same password across multiple accounts. And so when they do that, then the bad guys can use any of those compromised credentials they find on the dark web and say, well, do they use that same password for this account, or do they use that same password for that account? So that's why it's always so important as well to utilize unique passwords, especially on high privileged accounts. Utilize those unique credentials so that essentially they can't just use those compromised ones that are out there and be able to get in. And that's where multi-factor also comes into play as well too. It's always good to use multi-factor wherever it's available, so that you put that additional hurdle in front of those bad guys, so that they can't just use those credentials. Weak passwords is another way that we see those bad guys getting in. So essentially, if organizations don't have strong, password requirements set up, people tend to use very weak passwords and very common passwords. And so we see that hackers are able to easily brute force those passwords, such as winter 2025, summer 2025, those types of things. Trust relationships and propagation. So we're going to talk more in this presentation about vendor management and making sure you're understanding the controls that those organizations you're working with, have in place, because trust relationships is a way that essentially, if your vendor doesn't have the proper controls in, they could potentially get into your organization through your vendor if they're able to compromise them. Poor encryption is another mechanism that they're using to get in if you're not using the most current and up-to-date encryption standards. Unpatched vulnerabilities. I always say this is a very low-hanging fruit for those bad guys that are out there, because they're constantly looking to see, what vulnerabilities are out there, are things left unpatched, and then they're going after that. Misconfigurations, having an outside party look at configurations that you do is a very good practice, because there's tons of things that have to get configured. And sometimes a very small misconfiguration can leave a hole and an opening for those bad guys to get in. Malicious insiders, we talked about in the last slide and those statistics with those malicious insiders, making sure you're doing your due diligence on those individuals that you're hiring. And then 0-day and unknown methods. So that's another way that the bad guys use to be able to get into an organization.
Just chime in with an example. I know I see in my client base, um, very often, even if the control environment is very strong and a lot of these things are in place, very high password requirements, encryption, multi-authenticator requirements, it's still the old-fashioned way of phishing emails. I have a client who received an email in the accounting team requesting payment for a consulting agreement, something very general that maybe that person wouldn't be aware of the agreement because it was more at an executive level. And the perpetrator developed an email chain that showed what appeared to be the executive director of the organization approving these expenses and instructing the malicious vendor fictitious vendor to reach out to the accounting team and ask this specific person to please pay your invoice, things like that. But to Jessica's earlier point, it sounded very genuine. Before, it was very obvious there were grammatical errors, spelling errors that would really raise a red flag. Fortunately, this organization does have good internal controls as well on the accounting side, and in the review process, it was flagged that something just seemed off. There wasn't a PO for it, and so we were able to identify and reach out to the executive director, and he knew nothing about that. So we were able to stop the fraud before it got too far, but I'm just seeing more and more of it, just that old-fashioned way of the phishing emails.
Absolutely,
Great
Michelle.
example, Michelle. Go ahead.
I was just going to share as well too. You probably seen in the news, St. Paul, Minnesota actually had to call in the National Guard to help with a ransomware attack that they got hit with. So it's very much out there, and there's a lot of activity, especially like Michelle said, from that phishing side and from the ransomware side that continues to hit organizations.
Yeah, and I think that example really highlights the importance of employees. Can you share more, Jessica, about the role that they play?
Absolutely. So, unfortunately, the bad guys know that employees tend to be the weakest link in this. So, negligent insiders are usually the cause of many data breaches that happen. And I will say, in our work, that's what we usually see, that someone clicked on a link that they shouldn't have, and then it essentially opened a door for those bad guys to get in. Some of the other ways, sending work email to personal accounts, using data on insecure lines, connecting to like very public Wi-Fi's as well too. That's another thing that people sit there and lurk on those public Wi-Fi's to see if they can get or individuals connecting and then get into organizations. Not following corporate policies and not securing mobile devices. Mobile devices are like small little computers in our pockets these days. And so there's a lot of connectivity and information that is on those. So making sure that you're securing and you're protecting those mobile devices is really key. Making sure that you're training employees and, that they understand that they are a huge role in cybersecurity and in protecting the organization, just as the IT department is. But it doesn't just fall on IT. It really falls on employees across the board in the organization to protect the data and then the systems.
At my clients, I've seen that employees can be the weakest link, but to Michelle's example, they can also be one of your strongest defenses if they're trained right. And I believe that brings us to our first polling question, which is, what area of risk management concerns you the most? So again, we'll leave these questions open for about 60 seconds. So please make sure that you're responding promptly. But from here, we're going to go ahead and go and transition into the next topic. So, Christy, how can we protect our organization from fraud?
Great question, Erin, and happy to discuss fraud prevention in more detail today. But first, let's start with what fraud is. So, fraud is the intentional act or deception intended to gain an unfair advantage, often involving financial or personal gain. So, fraud always starts with opportunity or the ability to exploit, and it's typically a result of those ineffective or non existence and internal controls. Internal controls within organizations are the guardrails, such as policies, procedures, and the structure that prevents or detects fraud, error, or other risks. Risk, as we define it, is the what stops organizations from achieving, what their mission or strategic plan is. So in organizations, we often hear, excuse me, employees talk about their employees saying, "I trust them" or "I have faith in them." Trust is not a control, so we need to get rid of that mindset. We certainly value our employees, and we know that they, intend to do the right thing, but we've got to give them the tools to do that. So we have a graphic here. It's the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. They publish a report on occupational fraud. The most recent was from 2024. And in this report, they're basically describing the most common ways or that contribute to occupational fraud. So primarily, as you can see, the most common one is lack of internal controls at 32%, and the override of existing internal controls at 19%. So that's over 50% of fraud and occupational fraud can be contributed back to either strong or weak or non-existent internal controls. So it's important to focus on creating that strong environment. The last point I want to make here is that controls are not just something you pick up, you document or define them, and then you put them on a shelf forever. Just as the organization is changing, your control environment should be changing and responding to those emerging risks or changes within that risk environment. So it needs to be dynamic. So this slide really illustrates how common fraud can be. Certainly we hear about it in the news, you see headlines now and then, but you might not think it could happen to your organization. So the reality is 75% of US organizations are impacted by some type of fraud. 3 out of 4 employees admitted to stealing from their employer at least once. It could be not a significant amount, but all of these losses are real and impact the ability for your organization to achieve their mission, their intended purpose. It's true losses at the end of the day. The average fraud can go undetected for 12 months, and 80% of embezzlements impact small to mid-sized organizations. So those less with 150 people. And you may think, why is that? Why is it small organizations? Well, smaller organizations typically have less people and functions to create strong internal controls, such as those segregation of duties, which we'll talk about next. But I will say it's not impossible. It takes some additional crafting and some, certainly some considerations of how to best utilize the people, but it's truly something that you can overcome. And then the last data point I want to point out here is that the most prevalent way that fraud is identified is through tips. And that's important because it comes back to your organization's culture. So if you have a culture that is doing the right thing, and that's their motto, like, hey, we want to do the right thing, and it's formally can be considered like a code of conduct, an ethics policy, but that tone in your organization, that culture, certainly is helpful to having that ability for fraud to be reported and people raising their hand saying, hey, something doesn't look right. Also, another avenue, as mentioned, 40% of fraud is received through web-based tools. So that's like when you think about an anonymous tip line or a whistleblower hotline or any sort of other formalized reporting channel. So all these are things that are, should be considered as you think about your environment. So on the next slide, we have an example of where a fraud occurred. It was an embezzlement. The employee here was able to basically steal 1.4 million from this not-for-profit using unauthorized wire transfers and checks. She went also on to secure another job while she was waiting for trial on the first fraud, and used a different name and stole some additional funds from another not-for-profit. So what went wrong here? Certainly, ineffective internal controls. We like to call this this person having the keys to the kingdom, and no employee in an organization should have the ability to perform a transaction from start to finish, even at an executive level. Certainly, segregation of duties did not appear to be in place here. Typically, what we would see is one person prepares the request for payment in this, instance when she was able to take it out through ACH and check, and another independent person approves and releases the payment. Key to this being an effective internal control would not only be the definition of their responsibilities being to define different individuals, but also the access granted within the system. And that's key to making sure it is an effective internal control. So maybe, making sure the access, whether it's in the accounting system or the banking system, so that the person who's preparing the payment can't by way of system or banking access, release the payment. So that segregation of duties is in place. In the case of the second fraud, maybe a little more challenging to determine what exactly, how she was able to, use a different name. But certainly I would point to having a strong background process for onboarding new employees. So did you obtain the required pieces of information for employee verification? Did you perform a background check? Certainly if you have an employee that's, handling money in the organization, that's certainly a position that you'd want to screen through a background check. So those are the two things I would point to for that. Michelle, did you have an example here that you wanted to share?
So not specific to fraud, but just generally, this is something that I look for and see a lot, is that certain folks just have access to a lot of things. They're trusted in the organization, maybe they're long-term employees, or like you mentioned, they're executive team members, and maybe there's a lot of turnover in certain roles. So it just by default gets the access is granted to these individuals, but that just creates the environment where fraud can happen. And so just making sure that we have those appropriate segregation of duties, even in smaller organizations. And especially it's important, I would say, in those smaller organizations that, there's certainly different level of involvement of boards and what their oversight is. And there are some organizations that are small enough that require board involvement for certain approvals or releases. So, that might be appropriate, but just, making sure that we're not giving the keys to the kingdom to one individual, because it's either by fraud or by error, things can happen. And so entrusting everything to one person can really create some issues.
Thanks, Michelle. So what can you do today to start taking action, especially if these things that we're going to talk about or are on the slide are things that you maybe haven't done in a while, want to revisit? So first and foremost, assess risk within your organization. So knowing where you're most vulnerable to fraud or error, or anything that would cause something wrong to happen, or give somebody the opportunity to commit fraud or error. So making sure that you're doing this and you're recognizing those areas that carry increased risk. As Michelle noted, the board plays an important role, and we're going to get into that next, but discuss it at the board level. The board should be, engaged in the discussion of risk, especially when it comes to emerging risks. So making sure that there's active discussion of risk within your organization. Next, identify those critical processes. There is critical processes within every organization. Understand, who has access to perform those key processes, the key functions. We talked about the fraud with the ACH and check payments. Certainly, money leaving the organization is certainly key to make sure you have appropriate controls, but there's certainly other areas that we'll dive into as well. And then education, that culture we talked about, that's key. Creating a culture of, doing the right thing, raising your hand when things don't look right. Michelle had a great example earlier where, someone said, hey, this doesn't look right. We should probably dig into this a little further. But that's where that culture really comes into play. And really, those employees can be the problem. They can also be, as Erin mentioned, your biggest defense. So making sure you have that culture, you set those guidelines, you have those expectations, whether it's formally through a code of conduct that employees acknowledge that they read and understand, or just it's the environment of the organization set from the board level on down to the employees.
you, Christy. And with that, we're already at polling question number 2. How often does your organization currently assess risk? So go ahead and respond to that poll. Again, it will only be open for about a moment, and we are going to keep moving. So Christy, I appreciate again all those insights in the areas of fraud, and you've mentioned how important the tone at the top is. What else should organizations be focused on in the area of risk management?
Yes, Erin. So this is probably not where the audience maybe thought we were going to go, but certainly we'd want to highlight the key role boards play in not only fraud prevention, but just overall good governance and risk management. So boards serve that oversight role, including, as you know, we've mentioned numerous times, setting that tone for the organization related to things like acceptance of risk. So the board should really be, understanding where management's risk appetite is. They oversee management to ensure those internal controls that we've talked about are in place and are functioning and effective. Policies, are implemented. And in some cases, in smaller organizations, which Michelle alluded to, the board can be part of the control environment and, serve in a role of approval of certain types of transactions, payments, maybe new banking relationships, approval of large expenditure. That board can play an important role in the internal control environment. So diving deeper into some of these, we already discussed that board, establishes the tone and expectations, but we also want to make sure from a board perspective that they're really engaged. That third point on engagement, board members, have to understand that fiduciary responsibility that they hold as a board member, and making sure they're engaged in those discussions of risk and controls. Certainly, there's a lot of risks in organizations. They all vary, but making sure they're engaged and they're being proactive in those discussions. And then another important consideration, while not maybe directly related to fraud, but certainly the resiliency of the organization, is succession. So making sure that your board is actively engaged in those succession plans for leadership or any key members of the organization. This also applies to key board roles. So making sure there's active conversations about succession and planning for the future, or any unexpected turnover that certainly could have an impact on the organization's ability to carry forward their mission and strategy. So what does it look like if a board is not engaged or disengaged? So certainly we see it in boards, board team member or board members skipping meetings. So if you got a person that just can't seem to make a meeting, certainly maybe not as engaged and doesn't embrace their fiduciary responsibilities and oversight. Board members who are not prepared or have not read the board packages in advance, certainly another flag. Or they're not engaged in the conversation. So maybe they, aren't really, fulfilling their obligation by not challenging or to having those, being engaged in those critical discussions and decisions. Certainly if there's over reliance on the board or, on key staff members of the organization, certainly that can be an issue. The board has to, understand their obligation and their role and responsibility, and they can't always put the ownership back on the staff of that organization or the management team. Certainly if they're not aligned with the organization's mission, you certainly want board members who are very aligned with the goals of the organization, the mission that they want to achieve. If they're always kind of trying to pull the team in a different direction, or the other board in a different direction, maybe that's not the right fit for a board member. And then board members that do not seek or take advantage of the opportunities to attend, additional training up, that you offer them. So if there's conferences that you send board members to, and there's a certain board member that never wants to participate and seek out those additional educational opportunities, that certainly can be a red flag as well.
Christy, I'll just add, I interact with a lot of boards through my client base. I've also served on a couple of boards and seen some really well-run boards, highly effective and efficient boards, and then also on the other side where members are very disengaged and they're not really supporting the executive team or mission of the organization. I think you hit on a lot of the great points that are so important to have board efficiency. That engagement is so important. Having levels of accountability on your boards. We mentioned earlier that different boards may have different requirements and have different levels of engagement. There are many boards who are strategic and there is a resource for the executive team solely, whereas others may have to be involved in certain levels of management and oversight in a different level than some higher level boards. But just really understanding, make sure that the bylaws and board policies are reflective of the needs of the organization, just really important, and can really help set your board up. Just letting folks know that when you're signing up, this is what you're signing up for, and knowing the expectations, and also having committees that maybe can lean in certain areas more so than others, but really developing those board policies and making sure your bylaws are reflective of all those things. I see is really important in managing risk of any organization.
Thanks, Michelle. You gave me a good segue into our taking action. So what can you do from a board perspective and thinking about the activities that take place at the board level? So as Michelle said, making sure there's a process. So the bylaws are very well defined in terms of the board's roles and responsibilities, and having those formal board documents. Certainly a vetting process, having a good vetting process for anytime a new board member or there's a board open seat and having a new board member or application period, for people to apply, making sure that you have a very established vetting process and that you're very upfront with them in terms of the commitment and the ask and the responsibility that they're accepting if they get that board seat. Certainly that's, certainly a great place to start. I would also say making sure there's an appropriate background process as well for those board members. So making sure that they're don't have anything in their background that would, prohibit them from, serving on the board. And that would be in conflict with the overall organization. Setting expectations. So if there's an expectation for attendance at board meetings that, you can't miss more than, X amount of board meetings, set that expectation up front, make it very clear to those board members that, hey, we want active participation. This is what you're signing up for. If there's expectations for board attendance at, conferences for educational opportunities, make those, items clear. If there's, expectations for involvement in the community in which your organization serves, certainly make sure all those expectations are set up front so that they're very clear on what they're signing up for. Board packages, there's probably a lot that can be said for board packages. They can be very lengthy. There can be a lot of information. So keys here are making sure board packages are going out in advance. If you want your board to be engaged and active participants in those board meetings, and also to make sure that those board meetings are effective, make sure people have a chance to review those materials in advance, and give them enough time so that, if it's a week, if it's, even more time, depending on the length of material, certainly make sure that's happening and that they're notified that, hey, the board materials have been posted or they're, available for review. However, kind of your processes for distribution, certainly make sure that they're aware that materials are out there. I would also say make sure board packages are at the right level of detail. So sometimes they could be too much detail, too much information, very overwhelming as a board member to siphon through what's important, what's not important. So making sure there is some sort of, summary of like, hey, these are the things that you should really focus on. Maybe there's things that are included for, just, information only, but making sure you're really tailoring that board package to the audience, making sure it is at the appropriate level, giving them time to review so that when they come to those board meetings and the topic comes up on the agenda, that there can be active discussion because everybody's prepared for what the meeting wants to accomplish or what the board agenda needs to get through. So key things there for board packages. I'm sure there's probably a lot of maybe horror stories about how the length of certain board packages. And then finally, education. I mean, there's something to be said for education. I think that's going to be a common theme today, is education. So anytime you can update or give your board members more insight, whether it's an emerging risk within that impacts your organization, whether it's just on their roles and responsibility. There's certainly a lot of education out there that the board should be privy to and attending. So making sure that you're giving them the opportunity to further their education and help them in their role as a board member of your organization through additional educational opportunities. So those are the things I think, as a board, to focus on. Certainly there's probably others, but as you'll probably see, we're going to talk a lot about the same things, as we kind of move through the next area.
You, Christy, I appreciate you highlighting that. Board activity isn't always first of mind, probably when we're talking about risk and internal controls, but it is critical. And with that, we've arrived at polling question number 3, which is, how would you describe your board of directors' level of activity and engagement in risk management? So please make sure you're responding to the poll if you're looking for CPE credit today. And, we've covered many risks facing the public sector today. Jessica and Christy, are there any other areas we're seeing risk? I know early on, Jessica, you mentioned managed care providers and that being a potential area of risk.
Yes. So I can kick things off here. So the last area we're going to cover today is in vendor management, or third-party risk, is kind of the overall arching umbrella. So within vendor management, there's a number of different areas to consider. So always starts with that vendor selection process. So when you're going out to seek a new vendor, you've got, whether it's purchasing a product, so, securing a service, you have to identify a vendor to do that. So making sure you have a great, strong, controlled process for vendor selection. And it could be like, certain level of transaction or certain level of spend requires a 3-bid process. Certainly there can be some other thresholds involved. We're going to get into it a little more in terms of what we typically see as best practice, but certainly making sure you have that strong vendor selection process, knowing that, and we acknowledge, no, not all vendors are created equally. So we'll get into a little more specifics there. Second would be an overall vendor monitoring process. So key for vendor third-party risk management is vendor monitoring. So it's great. You got a vendor, you put them in your system. They're doing what you've engaged them to do. But there's critical vendors that, if we always like to say, if they close their doors tomorrow, it'd leave your organization within a world of hurt, and you'd really feel the pain of that vendor no longer being around and being able to support. So with making sure you have a process for identifying those critical vendors, certainly ones that have access to data, and I know Jessica's going to go into more detail there, but having a process around vendor management. Another key area in vendor management or overall third-party risk management is ensuring that when you're going through that vendor process, that you're identifying early in that vetting process. So when you're thinking about vendor selection, conflicts of interest, certainly that's key for, all organizations, certainly organizations that are, in the public sector arena, making sure that there is no appearance of a conflict or interest or known conflict of interest, certainly is something to be considerate of. And then there's certainly other considerations within vendor management, which we'll talk a little bit about, but, having that delegation of authority. So making sure, even Michelle mentioned, like, sometimes board members are involved and they have to be vetted all the way up to the board level. So making sure there's an appropriate delegation of authority to say, hey, depending on the spend, we're going to have, multiple layers of approval. Maybe it's going to go to the board. Thinking about things like over-reliance on key vendors. If you've got all your eggs in one basket, and if that vendor, closes their door tomorrow, like that could be a risk to your organization. So making sure there's, you're thinking about some of those other considerations when you think about vendor management. So from a vendor selection process, and these are what we would say are best practices or things that we see in strong vendor selection processes to consider. So having that bid process, whether it's any type of spend over a certain dollar amount requires 3 bids. That 3 bid process is really meant to make sure one, you get a competitive price, that you're certainly sourcing and putting it out there for multiple vendors to provide services to hopefully get the best, not only the best price, but the best and most qualified vendor to provide either the good or service. Having a defined process or some language around what considers a sole source vendor. Sometimes I see the overuse of a sole source vendor when you were like, well, that's really not the complete definition of a sole source. Having a defined definition, even having a list of examples of, hey, this would be considered a sole source vendor. And so that way those in that vendor process and that vendor management process know, yep, this is a sole source vendor I can go about. Otherwise it needs to go out for bid or further vetting. Certainly, we mentioned conflicts of interest. Certainly, this is key as you're doing your vendor selection. So making sure there's a process in place for all the employees within your organization, certainly up to the board level to annually or more frequently say, here are the organizations that I are a part of, or I have a role or a board seat, to make sure that we're aware of the conflicts of interest that exist. Certainly doesn't necessarily mean it prohibits you from utilizing that vendor, but it should be something of discussion before you proceed with awarding a contract or a purchase order to that vendor. Another thing to look at is organization's philosophy. So if you're going to outsource something to another vendor, it's probably worth your while to say, like, does this align with our organization and our mission? And is there, any conflict that would prohibit us from wanting to do work with that vendor? So certainly you want to partner with like organizations to provide goods or services. So making sure you're doing that as part of your vendor selection process. Another key one is financial health. So again, not all vendors are created equally, but certainly it's for some vendors, you probably want to make sure you're obtaining their financial statements or any other information that they can provide related to financial stability and financial health, so that that vendor that you're utilizing is going to be around tomorrow and for the longevity of the work that you want to do with them. Internet searches. So searching, vendors that you may be looking to partner with for any known, legal claims, anything out, from that would cause a reputational issues. So maybe they were named, in the news for something. Maybe there's, maybe some allegations against them. Doesn't prohibit you from doing the work, but again, it's just a pause and say, does this a vendor we want to work with? Maybe there's some additional additional information you'd want to obtain, and then certainly there, depending on your organization's criteria, there's certainly other things that you could do as part of the vendor process. Maybe it's important for you that the vendor you're working with is U.S. based. Maybe that's a key area of contemplation for you, that you really want U.S. based organizations. Maybe you even want organizations that are within the county that you support. So there could be other criteria that you want to put in your vendor selection process. Certainly up to you to define those things. And then I would say, last but not least, just making sure there's established approval levels, so that way when all the vendor information comes in, that there's appropriate sets of eyes on it before you move forward.
Right. Thanks, Christy. So with that, Christy talked through that due diligence to do when you're selecting the vendor. So then for any especially critical vendors that you work with, and for vendors, depending on their risk to the organization, you want to do regular vendor due diligence on those vendors. So some of the typical things that we see as part of that due diligence review, which should usually be done again on an annual basis for any critical vendors, and then and then your risk would drive your cadence for other vendor due diligence reviews. That contract review, making sure that you're aware of what's in the contract, having, different things identified that are going to be important to that contract. So if this contract is, say, with a managed service provider, that you've got your appropriate SLAs in there and that those are identified. If this contract is going to be with someone who's obtaining and hosting a lot of sensitive data, making sure that you've got protections in that contract about notification of any breaches or anything along those lines. So really, again, having your baseline for that contract and making sure you're reviewing that on a regular basis. Reviewing the organization that you're working with legal structure. And then like Christy said, that financial health. So not just at the selection perspective, but also on a regular basis that you're keeping up to date and you're understanding, where this organization is, from a financial perspective, because we don't want them to close their doors and then essentially, leave you high and dry type thing. So making sure you're staying on top of those financial results. Understanding if there's any current recent lawsuits that are out there against the organization. Knowing if they're going to use any subcontractors, because those subcontractors are going to be very important to making sure that they've appropriately vetted those subcontractors and that there's not going to be any type of open hole, open door, anything along those lines for those subcontractors as well too. Checking references, of the organization that you're going to be working with and doing those on a regular basis. Making sure that you're obtaining insurance certificates from them so that you know that they're insured and that you know that there is that, in place there. And then like Christy said, those conflicts of interest, continuously doing those so that you understand, what conflicts of interest are out there and that those are then regularly evaluated. For any vendors accessing or processing or hosting data, it's also important to understand what their business continuity and disaster recovery plans are going to be. So in the event that they are hosting your data, they go down, you want to understand that they have a process in place and that they've got the appropriate mechanisms in there to be able to recover. Also, from an incident response perspective, you want to make sure that they've got procedures in place that if they do get hit with any type of security incident, that they are going to be able to respond and they are going to be able to recover. Having that cyber insurance in place as well, checking for that. The SOC reports, so report on controls at a service organization. So getting SOC reports from any of your vendors that have them available and reviewing those to make sure that they don't have any major issues at the organization. So that's essentially an audit of their controls that they have in place. You want to review those reports to check and say, are there any issues? Is there anything we should be aware of, that's going on at this organization, from that perspective? And then reviewing the complementary user entity controls, which are included in those SOC reports. Those are the controls that the outsourced entity is saying that you, the organization, is responsible for. So making sure that you have those controls in place, at your organization, because that's what your vendor is essentially saying to you that is your responsibility.
And as Jessica mentioned, we won't spend too much time here, but for those critical vendors or high risk vendors, example, it could be your managed service provider. There's certainly other critical vendors to your organization. You should be doing these things often, whether it's on an annual basis, to ensure that if they close their doors tomorrow, or to prevent if they close their doors tomorrow, not having, had enough time to properly determine that, hey, we need to move to a different vendor. Hey, this is this relationship might not, work long term, but that you have options and you're aware early enough to make a different decision.
You, Christy. We have arrived at polling question number 4, which is, how does your organization approach third-party vendors' due diligence? So again, this will be open for just a minute. If you can go ahead and respond. Early on, Jessica, you mentioned that risk is coming from many different areas. So where should organizations focus? What are the key takeaways from today?
Absolutely. So where should you focus? So a few items here, data, really understanding where your crown jewels are, what that data is within your organization, and doing an inventory of that data. Then making sure essentially that data is secured as much as possible, right? So we talked a lot about this, about, people having the right access, for their job function, also making sure that, the people that need access to that data have access, but that you're not essentially sharing data across the organization that doesn't need to be. Focusing on that perimeter security and making sure that there's no, misconfigurations out there. Always having another set of eyes, take a look at that to say, is this configured appropriately? We've worked with a ton of organizations, as they've migrated to Microsoft 365. Microsoft 365 comes as default so that it is set in a way that makes it easiest to use, right? Security is not convenient. We know that. Sometimes, it's put in place so that it's easy to use. Well, you also have to consider security from that perspective. So having that other set of eyes to look at it and say, do we have, this set up in a way that's the most secure, but still be able to use it, right? Access, like we talked about, making sure that the access is appropriate for the employee's job function. Do regular reviews of access. We know people change job roles all the time. So making sure that you're staying up to date on what those access levels are of the individuals in your organization. Make sure you have the proper governance structure in place. So think about like contingency plans, business or incident response plans, information security programs, those types of things, making sure those governance pieces are in play. We talked a lot about the vendor piece, making sure you're doing your due diligence with any of those providers you're working with. Mobile, secure those mobile devices. Want to make sure that those are protected just as you would protect your computers, your workstations, your servers. Protect those mobile devices. And then focus on that human aspect. So, training the employees, making sure that they can understand what to recognize, not only from a cyber perspective, but also from an internal controls perspective.
I would just add on that access piece that oftentimes we give people by default more access than they need. It should really be the least amount of access for them to perform their job. When we think about opportunity, we give employees too much access, then they have more opportunity, whether it's error or intentional, to make mistakes or commit fraud. Certainly having the least amount of access to perform their job is certainly a great internal control in the environment.
Absolutely. So from a cyber perspective, key takeaways, regularly train those employees on cybersecurity and the different techniques and tactics that the bad guys are using out there, and have regular security assessments performed to identify those weaknesses and find those before the bad guys find them.
Yep, and then picking up with fraud, certainly proactively understand risk and understand it often in your organization, because organizations we know change frequently, and assess whether there's internal controls in place to proactively address those risks. From a board activity perspective, certainly making sure that the board members know the expectations and their role and responsibility within that organization. Certainly from a risk management perspective, a governance perspective, fiduciary responsibilities, et cetera. And then finally, on vendor management, making sure, again, that you have strong vendor management policies and procedures in place in the areas of vendor selection, vendor due diligence, ongoing monitoring for those critical vendors. All those things are going to help strengthen your organization's overall control environment.
Thank you. And that brings us to our final polling question of the day, which is, how are you feeling about the topics we've gone over today? So again, this polling question will remain open for about 1 minute. For some next steps, if cybersecurity is one of the areas of concern for you, since it is Cybersecurity Month, we are hosting a cybersecurity masterclass on October 22nd. You can find more information about that on Raymond's website, but that's another free, great resource for you as you're thinking about risk and controls. But that is going to conclude today's program. Thank you for joining us. With respect to people's time, we will be reaching out directly to answer any questions that were submitted. If you would like to learn more, again, please visit Raymond's website at www.raymond.com. And if you think of any questions after today's webinar, please contact us at publicsector@raymond.com. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.